Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious. Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for January 3rd, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation as we talk about Society of the Snow, not to be confused with Society of the Ice, which is my upcoming film about the pond hockey community that I created.
I was gonna say, how are you gonna find a way to tie this title to Florida? Because there's no snow there.
No snow here, except if you go indoors, there are a few ice rinks in the area.
That's true. That's true.
Including a huge, brand new memorial ice rink that the Panthers are moving into next year.
Oh, that's
Massive
right.
new rink in Fort Lauderdale.
That's right. I did hear about that.
And they're building there. I know of another one that's being built too in a city called Boca Raton.
Okay.
So that would make, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ice rinks in the area that I'm aware of.
Okay.
So,
wow. So there are some cold patches in Florida.
There are some cold patches.
They just have nothing to do with Mother Nature.
Exactly. So
It's manufactured coldness.
Exactly. So hockey is it's a growing sport here in the South.
Hey, and certainly scratches that itch of yours, I'm sure, right?
Absolutely. The Panthers are doing well. People really like it. The Lightning are a strong team. Dallas is good. Like hockey is, it's taking over the South.
You're just having a sports ball this entire month, aren't you? Really, this entire year thus far, not just with hockey, but also college football.
Let's not get crazy.
I
Football,
know.
on the football side, absolutely.
Yeah.
Michigan, of course, for anyone that listened to the main show this last weekend.
Yep, 20-minute segment on In Session Sports.
Exactly. My Detroit Lions are in the playoffs, so that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's about as far as it goes with my sports teams. The Detroit Pistons lost like 37 games in a row or whatever it was. So let's not get too crazy. Okay.
I'm just trying to make you feel good about it.
The Red Wings are terrible. But at any stretch, the whole point of that is to say Society of the Ice, that's my film.
That's your film.
Not to be confused with Society of the Snow, which is J.A. Bayona's new film.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about it.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to this one.
Out on Netflix now? Yes. By the time this episode goes out, it will be available.
Yes, that's true.
So go watch it right now. You can pause this, go watch it, come back in 2.5 hours.
We could not have timed this more perfectly, right, JD?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So with all of that laid out, Brendan, are you ready to dive into this film?
Yeah, I'm cold. Let's talk about it.
Let's do it. All right. Society of the Snow is directed by J.A. Bayona. It stars Enzo Vengrichik, Matthias Ricault, Augustin Pardella, Tomas Wolff, Esteban Bigliardi, and a slew of others that come and go throughout the film.
An airplane full of others.
An airplane full of others.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not familiar with this film, the flight of a rugby team crashes on a glacier in the Andes. The few passengers who survive the crash find themselves in one of the world's toughest environments to survive. All right. Well, I wanted to bring a little levity to the beginning of this podcast because the rest of it will be quite antithetical as we get into the arduous nature that is this film.
Yeah, that's true.
So, Brennan, what did you think about Society of the Snow?
And it's also a true story. I think you may have mentioned that in that plot synopsis, but yeah, this is a true story. Happened in 1972, if I'm not mistaken. And it was a plane crash that occurred in the Andes. I think it occurred in August, and it was a nearly 75-day stretch before they were rescued. And when we say they, it was, mathematically speaking, only a quarter of those who were actually on the plane ended up surviving. I think
16 survived.
16 survived out of, was it 44 or 45 people on that plane, including
Something
crew
to
members?
that
I think it was
effect.
something like that. This story was told before in cinematic form. There was a movie called Alive in 1993. It was directed by Frank Marshall and starred Ethan Hawke, of all people. I admittedly have not seen it, but I did hear about its reputation. I know the film is somewhat mixed as far as its critical rating is concerned. I think given the cultural impact and just the fact that this is directed by Juan Antonio Bayona, I think we can safely assume that this might be the better version of that story.
Yes.
It is a very riveting film. It's kind of a very simple film, as it really is about this event more than anything else. In some ways, it actually reminded me a lot of Ridley Scott's Black Hawk Down, where the historical event itself is kind of its main and almost only character, right? So this allows Bayona to focus more on the horror of the Andes Mountains itself, which are very well done. All of those scenes are very visceral. Like, you could really feel the frostbite in some ways. You really feel that cold. And the depiction of the plane crash itself is not for the faint of heart. If you're a squeamish person, I don't know if I can recommend this movie because
At
like,
least that scene, you
well,
have to skip it.
the thing is, like, it sets the tone for the rest of the movie. Like even though it's just one scene and it's very brief, the feeling that it leaves you with doesn't really ever go away. And I think a lot of that is because of how Bayona does a great job, like, capturing that sense of place, the literal coldness of the Andes. There are a few avalanche scenes that happen later on too that are weirdly just as brutal, even though they don't visualize any broken bones or anything like that. But yeah, as far as that crash being a great tone setter, it is really effective.
I mean,
And
I'm on the record of loving the film, but maybe Michael Mann could have given Bayona a call and said, "Hey, I got this crash scene. Maybe you do it.
Can you help me out with it?"
Can you help me out here?"
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm on record on loving Ferrari as well. And I mean, they're very different films, but if we are in the exercise of, or at least within the exercise of ranking all of these films, because we're coming up to the year end, right? I do think Ferrari is a better movie than Society of the Snow.
But in terms of the crashes, which
in terms
is
of the
what we're
crash,
talking
yeah,
about here specifically, one does it a little bit better than the other.
Yeah, if we're nominating the best directing jobs of the year, just based on one single moment of action, then Bayona would certainly be top 5. I mean, probably Christopher Nolan for Oppenheimer would still make the cut in some way, but yeah, what Bayona does for that plane crash, we can talk about it for a while, because aesthetically and creatively, it is really
chilling.
effective.
Yeah.
Literally quite chilling. And that like just the depiction of the event and how Bayona treats the event is really the reason to watch this. Like, it's not really a movie about getting to know who these people are. We get to know a few of them, but in many ways, they're really more ciphers for this historical event and the trauma that it caused, which is why I do compare it to something like Black Hawk Down, which is a movie I love. I absolutely love what that film is going for. But it's not really a movie about character, right? It's not really a movie about getting to know who these people are. You don't get a war hero that is all about trying to make a life that matters, or those typical cliches and things like that. And that's the same case here with Society of the Snow. It's really about this event. And I think in that sense, the simplicity of it is why it is effective. I'm not sure if it needed to be nearly 2.5 hours long. I think there could have been more of a briskness to really, like, emphasize the urgency maybe a little bit more. But at the same time, there are too many individual components that are just so effective you can't ignore it. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot about the voiceover narration. That's a really interesting choice the film makes, and a very deliberate one as well. So yeah, it's a very interesting movie, very effective movie, very visceral movie.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the best survival movies that we've seen in recent years. It is grisly. It is harrowing. Bayona doesn't hold back in terms of depicting the horrifying nature of what these people experienced, but he does so with tender diligence and emotional nuance. There's a deep reverence to these individuals that is remarkably poignant. He uses their real names, for one. And secondly, he pauses throughout the film to show text on screen who has died.
Yeah, I love that touch.
Gives us context and perspective to the audience, but more importantly, it's a moment of respect to those who lost their lives. And it's very effective. It not only adds to the film and its tender qualities, but it makes the story all the more lived in and traumatic. something that is equally rivaled in how Bayona depicts the distressing hellscape they were trapped in. The way he captures the dangers of the mountain is nothing short of bone chilling, especially that first night after the crash,
Yeah.
where they're all huddled together inside the fuselage and trying to survive the freezing midnight temperatures. It is remarkably visceral. The
Yeah.
screams and the unrelenting shaking that we see in these characters, it is hard to watch. But beyond that, there's the lack of resources, the realization that planes won't be able to see them from above, the potential for avalanches, and the general fact they can't go too far without freezing to death. All of this comes through vividly in Bayona's direction and storytelling, which gives way to an astounding irony, and that the film is as beautiful as it is arduous, because Bayona isn't shy in showing us the majesty of these mountains. On several occasions, we get large, wide shots to demonstrate the visual grandeur of the landscape. And it's a striking juxtaposition to the limited perspective of these characters. And when you couple that with the polarity of the film's tone, again, Bayona's tender veneration as compared to the horror these characters experience, that irony weighs even heftier. It's a remarkable directorial achievement. Bayona may not crack the 5 at the Oscars, and he may not crack anyone's 5 at the Infraction Film Awards, but it's still pretty astounding how he captures those ironies here. Part of it is his filmmaking, but it's also this incredible ensemble cast. Everyone is really great here. Michael Giacchino's score is extremely
It's pretty
moving.
effective. Yeah.
It's really great. In a year where foreign cinema is already spectacular, Bayona comes in at the last minute, our last review of the year, with another stellar entry.
Yeah, he's better at making movies like this than he is Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom, which I barely count as a Bayona film. That was a director for hire job, and really where that film is at its most interesting is when we can sense, oh yeah, that is a Bayona touch, isn't it? Okay, I see what you're going for there.
Yep.
But yeah, this is definitely more in the wheelhouse of what he has done before, and he's done quote unquote disaster movies like this before, or at least he's done one before. That film being The Impossible with Naomi Watts, Ewan McGregor, and a very young Tom Holland.
Yep.
I do think this film is more successful because it is very centralized and it really allows the event to take hold and really be the driving force here. So this is definitely his wheelhouse for sure. I do think it is very effective. You're right that there is a really interesting juxtaposition between the beauty of the Andes Mountains and how like torturous that it is, how treacherous that it is. So in a weird way, the sense of beauty almost becomes a scare tactic for Bayona. And I like the way he takes advantage of that. It's for how big and vast this area is that this plane crashed in. A lot of this still feels very claustrophobic. And it's primarily because of the circumstance, given where they're located here. They're not too far from Chile, which I believe is where they were going, Santiago, Chile. So the fact that it's just over the mountains, just out of reach, makes it all the more harrowing, rather. And in these situations, the temperatures drop so suddenly that you are forced to keep warm in tight spaces. So the fact that Bayona chooses to emphasize that tightness of space and not focus on the literal beauty surrounding them is a very wise call, because some of those scenes in the plane when everyone's just huddled together, simply having conversations about what they need to do to survive. And if you're not familiar with this story, where they have to go to survive is a very daunting one. And it involves cannibalism. That's something that they had to resort to. That is very much kind of the big common thing that this story is sort of known
big
for.
Debate amongst these characters.
It is, which is, we'll talk about the voiceover narration in a little bit. But yeah, it is a big debate amongst these characters. There's almost a sense of like a spiritual debate happening there as well. But yeah, that's a huge component here. The cannibalistic nature of how these people had to survive is sort of what makes this story so notorious. And Bayona is willing to let it be almost like a character here as well. And I appreciate that.
I agree as well. I think that's why the claustrophobic setting that you're describing there, it's important to this film, not just for us to understand
Hmm.
how limited these characters must have felt in terms of escapability, in terms of perspective, how hopeless they must have felt.
Yeah.
But what that does is heighten, because of what they had to do in order to
Hmm.
survive, it heightens this idea in the film that I really love regarding this idea of togetherness.
Hmm.
And not just with the Numa character, who we will talk about here in a moment,
Yeah.
which the film follows quite closely.
Hmm.
Others show compassion and urgency throughout this film. I think of the Roberto Canessa character,
Yeah.
who is this medical student. He goes out of his way to help others who are injured, especially early on, but throughout the entire film. The group doesn't always agree on what's to do best, but in the end, they only survive because they're in it together.
Yeah.
They show incredible innovation. They show remarkable ingenuity. They incessantly demonstrate respect and reverence to each other, especially when things are at their most arduous.
Hmm.
And you could argue more than anything else, that's why they ultimately survived, because
Hmm.
their minds would have rotted away quickly without it. In
Yeah.
fact, it's the only reason Roberto made the hike with Nando that we see at the end.
Yeah.
He didn't really have the strength, but his friends kept encouraging him. They urged him on, and eventually it allowed him to have a little hope and courage. It sounds a little tacky to articulate out loud, but in context of this film, it's anything but that. And again, Bayona handles it with great diligence, and seeing
Hmm.
these characters come together and constantly lean into that togetherness, that brotherhood, that the bonding that they would have had over a situation like this. I found it pretty entrancing here.
Yeah, yeah, they all have very specific character traits that give them not just a personality, but a motivation, right?
Yeah.
Many of them don't necessarily have arcs per se, which is fine. Like I don't think this
Yeah.
movie necessarily needs that. Really,
No, I agree.
the only character or person rather that has a so-called arc in the most traditional sense to this being a movie, it's Numa, played by Enzo Volgranik. And he is our cipher. He's our narrator, our literal narrator here. We'll talk about him in a little bit. But yeah, you do get this driving motivation, and you can sense this driving motivation from people like Roberto and Nando to make this hike and really help these people out, because the camaraderie between these people does feel genuine. It does feel real. So as a performative piece, the film is very effective, and Bayona is still willing to capture those attributes. And I love movies that do this, that are so like heavily gruesome and all about the devastation in some ways. And you know, another example would be The Iron Claw from earlier this year. That's a film that could have come off as overly gratuitous in its tragedy, but there is more so than not a sense of love and a sense of companionship
Yeah.
in that film, and that's also what's very evident among these people here trying to
Exactly. Same
survive,
thing
and that's
here,
what
yeah.
makes it so effective.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've referenced Numa a couple of times. I want to
Yeah.
talk about him in the
Yeah.
narration here. Now, I
Yeah.
haven't read the book that this is based on,
Neither have I.
but Bayona has talked about how using Numa's diary entries as voiceover in this film, it gave this a metaphysical quality, this spiritual overtone that complements its emotional underbelly. That on its own terms, I think, is enthralling,
Mhm.
because it gives way to thoughtful and poignant humanization, something that is missing in a lot of survival movies that that want to emphasize the facts of a story.
Yeah.
I love that Bayona wants to tap into something deeper beyond what just happened to these individuals. But another irony here is that those diary entries in this film are actually fictional.
Mm.
Bayona essentially had 50 hours of conversations with the survivors. He talked to Numa's family and friends,
Yeah.
and felt he had such a great idea as to who this guy was.
Yeah.
And given the choices that Numa makes in the film, you can see why Bayona felt so compelled by him, because he's one of the most selfless characters in this story. He didn't save anything for himself. He was always concerned with others. And eventually it caught up to him in the end, but it raises some fascinating questions about the human spirit when it's under that kind of scrutiny and pressure. the biggest question that Bayona raises inside of that idea is, what's the meaning of all of this? That's a question that
Hmm.
comes up in this film. It's obviously a large question that a lot of films raise. It's probably the notion we wrestle with the most in our lives, and art is a fascinating way to explore and articulate our feelings of it.
Sure.
And given the stakes at play here, it makes sense that Bayona would want to wrestle with how these characters would constantly be wrestling with the meaning of their circumstances. An idea
Hmm.
that comes through so poignantly in that scene with Javier Mathal as he
Yeah.
articulates beautifully his purpose in life at this moment. But it also defines Numa as well. His choices, his sacrifices, the love that he shows, it all renders so much heft to the end of this film and the relief that these characters exhibit in the
Yeah.
end, because we know that Numa was a big part of them getting home. And I love that Bayona chooses to give us his perspective throughout. It's not a
Yeah.
conventional choice, but it's a deeply
Oh,
thoughtful one.
yeah. I do want to talk about this because we've talked about this many times, JD. I am someone that doesn't usually love voiceover narration, right? In
Hmm.
fact, one of my least favorite forms of voiceover narration is narration by a dead character. So here, like examples of classic movies where it doesn't really work for me. Sunset Boulevard. The voiceover does not work for me in that movie. Another example, Danny DeVito's role in LA Confidential. The voiceover does not work in that movie for me.
Wow.
Somehow it
Brendan
works
with
in this
all
movie.
kinds of hot takes on this episode. My
It's just
God.
no.
Yeah.
It's a narrative style that I was just never able to really accept. It's really more of a me thing. I always found it kind of cheap and almost like kind of cheating in some ways for certain films.
Yeah.
But I do think Bayona gets away with it here.
Yeah.
And I think it's because of what you're talking about. Admittedly, if there's any issues I have with the voiceover, I do wish some of the dialogue, the actual written dialogue, was maybe a little bit less rudimentary at times. Like some of the earlier stuff that Numa is narrating to us, it sometimes doesn't come off as any more insightful than the Andes Mountains. They were very white. Like it sometimes is very simple, but when when those layers are peeled back even further to tell us why Numa is our main character, really, that's where I was really able to start accepting it for what it is. Because you're right, Numa had a very important role in their survival, even if he is tragically no longer with us. He was one
Yeah.
of the unfortunate souls who perished
He was the
on
last
site.
one, too.
He was
The last one.
so the idea that the last one to die is telling us this story, who is also the one who more or less pushed Nando and Roberto to make this hike in the first place.
Hmm.
Uh, that adds a level of spirituality to this film that I do think it
Yeah.
needs and requires, and I do think it's handled very well. It's very graceful in that regard. So yeah, I think in the end I was able to come around on the voiceover
Yeah.
because of that symbolic purpose.
Exactly. Like there's no narrative or dramatic trickery to it.
No.
It's
Well, there
simply,
is, but it's the right kind of trickery. It's the kind that I think it needs because
yeah.
even despite that, Bayona is still playing with certain tropes to emphasize the dramatic urgency of Numa perishing the way he does. But it's like that's not a trick in a bad sense. Like movies are
Yeah.
always tricks. There's always
Well,
trickery involved with moving people.
Well, the reason I avoid using the word trickery, or the way I would articulate it as Bayona avoiding trickery, is that he never hides the fact that it's Numa.
Right.
And if you
Right.
know how this narrative plays out, then you know that he's
Yeah,
already.
it's not gimmicky, which I appreciated.
I agree. It's not as if it's some sleight of hand as, ooh, who's this voiceover character? And it turns out it's the last character.
Right,
Like,
right.
we know who it is from the beginning. Numa is one of the very first characters, if not the first character we see on screen. It's clearly his story in many regards.
Mhm.
And the voiceover is always him. It never bounces around. It's no one else. So Bayona isn't hiding anything. And
Right.
if you know how this story plays out, now I didn't necessarily,
Mhm.
but if you know how this story plays out, and look, you can go and read up on Wikipedia who lived and who died, and
Yeah,
you'll
there's a
see
full
his name
story
there
about it.
as
It's
one
a
of the
fascinating
deceased.
story. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's not as if he's hiding from that. So I don't
Right.
find it to be a level of trickery, but what he's taking someone that didn't survive, but he's using the traits of the character to what you're saying as far as this spiritual
Hmm.
symbolism, this weight that exemplifies the perseverance of these characters
Hmm.
and what they're willing to do in order to survive. The
Yeah.
irony of that, though, is that Numa ultimately made choices that became his downfall.
Right.
He avoided doing some of the things that was necessary to survive, but he did so because he didn't want to take away from everybody else.
Yeah.
There was a level of sacrifice involved. And that, and I'm not even talking about just the cannibalism or the food aspect
Yeah.
of it. It's
Yeah.
also him going on hikes. It's him trying to get out of certain predicaments. Like he was always at the forefront of the ingenuity. He was always at the forefront of exploration or trying to find some sort of path out of this.
Yeah.
And it was always about everybody else. It was never about him. So choosing Numa as that representative, I think, is a really beautiful and poignant choice. And I think the performance by Enzo from Gintrix is really
It's
great at
effective.
tapping
Yeah.
into that. It's very effective. So I think it's a great tool that Bayona uses here to tell this story dramatically, but especially emotionally.
Yeah.
And I like how pragmatically he
Well,
plays it.
and it kind of becomes literally spiritual in some ways too. The fact that
Yeah.
Numa did refuse to eat or partake in that act of cannibalism, a lot of it was because he was looking out for
Yeah.
his other survivors who needed to survive, but it was also because he just didn't feel like it was right. Like he didn't
Yeah.
feel like it was the right thing to do. And
Yeah.
we first meet him at a church, so the
Yeah.
film is very literally depicting him as something like
Yeah.
that, as
Religion
this
is
almost
at
savior.
the core of the debate as far as why they should do this or
Yeah,
not do this.
yeah, which in a weird way adds maybe an inadvertent nuance to the film's conclusion about when these people are saved, whether they should be respected for that because of what they had to go through. Like that overarching sense of spirituality almost makes it seem like we should cheer them on as much as we should judge them for partaking in that. So it's like, and Bayona is very good at doing that. Most of his best films, whether it be The Orphanage, A Monster Calls, they have these thematically ambiguous conclusions that kind of reveal themselves as you think about it. And
Mhm.
I feel like Society of the Snow is doing that in its own way. It's not a form of heroism by the end as far as how these people survived and what that meant. If anything, we look at Numa in that way,
Mhm.
but these other people don't always feel that way. Like they question it, and Numa tells
Mhm.
us that they question it. And I like the way that that's handled. I think it is effective.
I agree. And to speak to what you were saying about the simplicity of the narration at times,
Hmm.
I think what's interesting about that is how it circles back to the artificiality of it. Because the
Yeah.
film, if there is any trickery to the narration, it's that Bayona conveys it as if these are diary entries that he's writing.
Yeah, I mean, it is a manufactured form of narration, as you were talking about.
Absolutely. Because the truth is, there were no diary entries. He
Yeah,
completely made that up. And I think by, the voiceover narration being somewhat simple or rudimentary, as you called it, is certainly indicative of it being manufactured. And also perhaps tapping into the level of uncertainty these characters would have been facing.
hmm,
Not to necessarily excuse the writing, perhaps it could have been a little bit more refined. And I
yeah.
think it very much is by the end of the film,
By the end, yeah, I
but
agree.
I
I
think
agree.
it somewhat tethers to that artificiality in an interesting way. That still works for me. I love the narration here, who it is, and
I j-
ultimately how it
I just have
functions in the film.
I just have to give a movie like this credit for convincing me that voiceover narration from a dead character can work.
Yeah,
Like,
I think that if you're
yeah,
going to do it, this is and
this is
again,
the way to do it.
I think also a lot of it, as I noted in my opening thoughts, the other factor that really works for me here is the deep reverence that Bayona shows
Hmm.
constantly throughout this film. I talked about a few examples early on, and how he shows respect to these individuals. He doesn't shy away from their real names. And that choice, I think, is interesting when you couple it with what you were talking about earlier, the crash sequence. He doesn't hold back. It's visceral. He shows you everything. You can read the stories about what happened to everybody inside that plane, and maybe your imagination will run wild there. Bayona sticks to the facts. He shows us it. We see it all unfold on screen.
Yeah.
And there's something about watching the pragmatism of that with these characters that are using, again, not fictional names, the real names. I'm sure that's going to be really hard to watch. It is really hard to watch, but especially if you knew any of these individuals, I can't even fathom watching that. But that's why his reverence to these individuals, I think, is so important to this film, and it adds to that emotional underbelly. And Numa's narration and choosing Numa just adds to that deep reverence and respect.
I agree. And the crash, to go back to it just for a moment, it is very visceral. I watched this movie with my wife, and at that time, at the night that we watched this, we were actually sleeping in separate beds because I was really sick that night, and I was just trying to keep my distance. I won't get into the details to not gross people out, but when we got to that scene, it was late at night. She looked at me and said, "Okay, you're sleeping in my bed tonight."
Yeah, I mean, it's brutal. It's
and
really,
we started
really
this.
brutal.
We started this movie at like 11 p.m. and we got through the entirety of it. And I know I somewhat criticized the length a little bit of my opening thoughts. The film never bored me, but I did wonder if nearly 2.5 hours was necessary to tell this full story. But I do think, for the most part, Bayona does take advantage of every minute he has, and doesn't waste too much space. So I do think it's at least fairly smooth in that regard.
I thought it very much was. I was always compelled by the choices these characters were making, the sacrifices they were making, and also this deep debate that they had to go on in terms of, eating other people and what that meant, who chose to do it, who didn't, and those who didn't, ultimately how they had to cave in.
And if there's one thing that Bayona rightfully chooses not to show us, it really is that cannibalism. Like, it is there, and it is somewhat shown to us, but
a little bit. There are a few moments.
What we don't see is the literal preparation for that. Like to get as detailed as we can here. People like, I think it's Roberto, for instance, literally cutting off limbs of the dead and prepping that for food. Like, that's what he's we don't see that. So that's at least left to the imagination of not just us, but really puts us in the perspective of Numa, right? Because he's the one that's kind of in the background letting this happen and not watching it.
Yeah.
So I do like that touch.
I agree, although there is one exception, and I think it is very appropriate, and that leads to another sequence I want to talk about here. This might be a little bit of a spoiler, but again, we're talking about history if you want to go and read up on the facts on this story. But there's an avalanche scene about halfway through this film that I think is devastating, as it comes off the only moment in the film where they're able to share in some sort of normalcy. We see them laughing and joking. There's some levity to be had as they're settling in for the night. But then we start to hear the rumble of the mountain. The fuselage is starting to shake. And it's incredibly visceral. Going back to Bayona's direction and how he depicts these moments, we are with the characters. They're all in camera. Yeah. The camera is simply at the end of the fuselage. They're all there. And in an instant, just snow everywhere. Yeah. Like, you hear the noise, you see their trepidation and fear, and then just snow everywhere. And then they're screaming and they're gasping for air and trying to get out.
And not only that, then it happens again.
And then it happens again. And so they're stuck underneath the snow twice, which leads to that exception, because they're stuck in this fuselage for quite a few days. Yeah. And if they're going to survive, they need to eat. One of the characters that have perished is there, and they're forced to have this debate once again. Yeah. And we see one of the characters carve into it's darkly lit, so you can't quite see it, but it's
Mhm.
still there on screen. You see him cut into him, and he pulls out a liver or whatever he does.
Oh, I think it was the heart, if
The
I'm not
heart, yeah,
mistaken.
and they
Yeah.
start eating it and passing it around,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's a pretty chilling moment in this film.
Yeah, but even so, like there's a certain effect on it that Bayona employs, and he also kind of frames it almost like it's in the corner, like you're still trying to look for it. The fact that we couldn't even really tell what it was, what
Yeah,
organ it
yeah,
was,
yeah,
I think just kind of proves the point that we're making, and I do think it is the right point that Bayona makes, not gratuitously divulging in the cannibalism here. Like
yeah.
we know it's here, we sometimes see it, but we don't always. It's
Mhm.
it's not what's important.
I agree. I agree. And then we see how they ultimately are able to get out of that situation, which
Mhm.
that whole sequence is fascinating as well.
Sure.
One other character I want to talk about is Nando.
Okay.
So Nando is an interesting character because he, on the initial crash, he obviously survives, but he's in a coma for 2 days or something to that effect.
Yeah.
So he's there, knocked out. He comes to, and he comes to see that his sister is not doing very well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he gathers himself, and then he's trying to comfort her. Again, I'm just going to give this away. It's real history. I apologize if I'm spoiling too much here, though. But there comes a moment where his sister passes, and he
Mhm.
has to react to it. And it's devastating, obviously, to see him react to it. But I think what's
Yeah.
more interesting is how it offers him some composure. Like it
Mhm.
motivates him.
Yeah.
Because the other element is that his parents or his mom died on impact.
I think
Something,
so.
there was another
Yeah.
family member. I think it was his mom.
I think
Had,
it was his mom, yeah, because we saw in another flashback that confirms it
yes.
that his dad was the one that stayed behind, I think.
Yeah.
I
So
think. Yeah.
his mom had died on impact. Sister dies after a few days, and we see him become highly motivated. He's walking around during the daylight hours, trying to gather strength when there needs to be some sort of exploration. He's volunteering. He's going out on these missions, trying to find people, find other things that can help them. They
Mhm.
eventually find the back side of the fuselage that has a radio, and he's on the forefront of that mission trying to get the radio to work, which is an interesting element to this film. And then
Yeah.
he's one of the chosen ones at the end to hike through the mountains and into Chile. Is that where I'm trying
They're going to
remember?
Chile. Yeah.
They're going to Chile. So he's one of the individuals that so like that trajectory. Earlier, you noted that there's not many arcs in this film, and I do agree with that. It is
Yeah.
very much about the survival and
Yeah.
the togetherness of these characters. But if there are any arcs here, he's certainly one of them, and
Mhm.
it's interesting to
Fair.
see how death motivates him in this very distinct, specific, almost energetic way at times.
Yeah, and not just from the help of Numa, as we talked about as well. He's
Mhm.
Numa, and the influence of Numa sort of reinforces what was
Yes.
already there in
Yeah.
Nando.
Yeah.
Uh,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, but yeah, those moments he has with his sister just before she passes, yeah, those are definitely some of the most character-driven moments in a movie that doesn't necessarily need character-driven moments like that, nor is it really about that, but it makes sense to do that because Nando is one of our most important figures in how this rescue actually took
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
So
The
so that's
16
good
don't survive
storytelling.
without him.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's good storytelling and focusing on the right people and getting to that point and how, almost in a procedural like way that is very
Yeah.
well handled for sure.
Absolutely. And while maybe not emphasized quite as distinctly as Nando, I mentioned Roberto Canessa earlier.
Yeah.
I he's a big part of that as well.
Yep, for sure.
And of course, Noma is the nucleus around all of these characters.
Mhm.
And again, I'll just Numa is one of Yeah, he's a great character. I really love him here, and I love the spiritual center that he provides for this film. So
Yeah, and it's a good performance as well.
yeah,
I've
it
seen a
is.
few people on Twitter or X, as you want to call it, talking
I don't
about.
call it that. No.
I'm not calling it X. I know that's the official name for it, but I'm still calling it Twitter. I'm just used to that. But I have seen a lot of people talking about Enzo Volgranich's performance and how it probably shouldn't get overlooked as much as it is. I mean, he's
It's good.
obviously
It's real good.
he's obviously not going to get nominated for things. We know that because the competition's just way too stiff. But it is a very good performance. And the last thing I'll say about him is if we're mispronouncing his name wrong, we apologize.
Apologies, absolutely. As always, apologies for butchering these names. I'm sure I have with all of them,
but it is I mean, it's a very well performed film overall, but I think he in particular is quite great here.
And to your point earlier, I know you compared this to something like Black Hawk Down. I do want to echo that in Bayona's direction, the pragmatism of this film. He really does lay out these events. We see characters respond, they make choices, and because of that, and through conversations with each other, we do get to learn about some of them for sure.
Yeah.
But I Bayona though sticks to this story.
Yeah.
He does it with reverence. He does it with poignancy, but characters do come and go, and we see the effects of, these hazard conditions in this really brutal and visceral way. And I do think that comes through wonderfully in Bayona's direction, and the pragmatism of this mountain and this landscape, I think, is really well rendered.
Yeah.
And I like how, you couple that with how these characters behave in the daylight. It is really interesting. It's a lot less hazardous. That's when they're out trying to figure out ways to survive.
Yeah.
But you couple that with the real life images that were taken, because they did have a camera and they
That's
did
true.
take some
Yeah.
images.
Yeah.
And that's something Bayona does showcase here as well. Like he restages these photos in a way that to me, it didn't feel like pandering to history. Like, oh, they took these photos, so we have to redo it. Like it kind of, he seamlessly blends that in with the storytelling.
Yeah, I'm with you. It felt like a character moment.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
that's how you could take advantage of something like that without it feeling schmaltzy or tricky or cheap. And I don't think it does. Yeah, it's a very effective movie.
I agree. My last thought, I will just simply reiterate the great Michael Giacchino.
It's a good score.
Amazing piece of music.
Very good score.
It's really great. I've listened to the whole thing twice already.
Yeah, very somber score. It's not really about big grand melodies that Giacchino is. Giacchino is really one of our most varied and diverse film composers. There are times he has tried to emulate John Williams, and then there are other times he's creating something so vibrant and jazzy when he works in a Pixar film or something like that. It's like he is very diverse. And then he does something like this, which is very much about tones and like certain emotional cues, and it's really good stuff.
I agree. He does have a complexity to his music that's really great. He can stir emotion in ways that is, I don't know. He's able to tap into like my inner core so easily. It feels like his music creates this emotionality at times that I fall under its spell.
I can just picture your reaction if, and I don't know if this has been revealed yet, but if he is not returning for Inside Out 2, you might boycott that movie, right?
I might. It's very possible. Very possible. That is the other big example for sure. I hear one note of that and just instant tears, instant sadness. It's so good. It's so good. But yeah, I mean, and this is similarly in that vein of like, man, like these musical cues are just, it's gonna sting.
He's got an ear for melody. He really does.
Sure. At any rate, those are our thoughts on J.A. Bayona's latest film, Society of the Snow.
Good film.
Do you, how would you rank this in his filmography? I don't know if you've thought about that at all.
Yeah, of his 5 feature films, I'd put this third. Okay. Would I? I don't know. The Orphanage is number 1. I mean, there's no topping that, at least anytime soon. So it is a toss up between this and a Monster Calls, but I kind of like the gothic sensibilities of those two films, which is why I might put those two at the top. So then I put this one at 3, just above The Impossible and Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom, which barely counts.
Fair enough. I'm with you. The Orphanage and A Monster Calls are still my 2 faves, but this is like this is solidly at 3, and honestly, I'm closer to those 3 than obviously like Jurassic World, for example.
Yeah.
And I do like The Impossible overall as well. I do. I do like it.
The problem I have with The Impossible, and again, it's really just the circumstances of that true story. It's the separation of that family. I know that's how it was, that's how it needed to be told, but I don't know if Bayona manages or handles the separate narratives all that well. I think that's really that film's biggest problem.
Yeah, I do agree that Society of the Snow is a more seamless narrative. It certainly helps that most of these characters are all in one location.
That's not really a credit to Bayona. That's a credit to the tragedy, I guess.
Yeah, but there are elements, again, of characters going out, scavenging, trying to find things to help them survive. So there are moments where a few of them move away from the fuselage and where everyone else is. Yeah. But I think those moments are handled extremely well. And obviously they're necessary to tell this story.
Yeah.
So, The Orphanage, A Monster Call, Society of the Snow are all great films. All very good.
Absolutely.
And The Impossible, I still think is good. Maybe not as great as those 3, but still good.
Yeah, it's good.
And Jurassic World is barely. I can't discredit him.
It's the best Jurassic World movie for what that's worth.
Yeah,
because it's at least kind of interesting.
I agree. There are moments where I think his ethos comes through. Far and few in between, but it's not his fault necessarily.
No, that's a trilogy's fault. It's nothing to do with him. Yeah,
exactly.
He was directing a terrible script.
100%. Yes.
Yeah.
At any rate, with that said, let us know if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say. You can hit us up on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below. We would love to hear from you. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, all that fun stuff. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, rate and review us. We would really, really appreciate that.
Yeah.
You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com as well. Brendan, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
I guess one more plug. Award show, top 10 show, coming up soon, very soon. If you're listening to this, it's going to be the next 2 shows that we release. The next 2 shows we release. Yeah. Absolutely. And part 1 is the awards part of it, where we go through all the categories. Part 2 will be our top 10 movies of 2023. So be on the lookout for that. It's one of the best and longest shows of the year, but we hope that it's enjoyable. We always love doing it anyway. So be on the lookout for that. As we've noted a couple of times over this last week, we have several different reviews that are already out. That you can go and check out. We did Ava DuVernay's Origin, The Iron Claw. We did The Color Purple at the beginning of the week. So all of that is available. And of course, there's episode 566 where we talked about the best scenes of 2023. So go and check all of that as well. It was a great year. I love 2023. Hell of a note to end on. Stacked, man. Now it's just so stacked. To the awards. Yeah. Moving on to 2024. So with all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, I love a good Bayona film. He needs to keep doing stuff like this. No more Jurassicness.